Hi, I'm Carl Weber. Welcome to Video-Aided Instruction series on writing a great research paper. In this program, we'll be discussing how to take notes as you do your research. Does this sound mundane? Maybe, but when we talk about note-taking, we're really talking about the heart of scholarship. At its best, note-taking is the art of absorbing, recording, tracking, organizing, and using information that you gather from the work of previous thinkers, and this is what research is really all about. Good note-taking is also an extremely practical skill. Taking good notes while writing a research paper makes the work of drafting the paper much easier. Good notes will help you think through the connections among your ideas, see the logical flow from one topic to the next, and develop evidence that will support your point of view effectively. Of course, good notes also help you create references, footnotes, and a bibliography that will meet the requirements of scholarly practice, satisfy your teacher's expectations, and help you earn a high grade on your paper. So for all these reasons, note-taking is a very valuable skill, though it's also highly neglected and little understood by most students. By the time you complete this program, you'll have a note-taking toolkit that will help you enormously through the rest of your academic career. In its most basic form, research means reading, absorbing information from written materials such as books, articles, speeches, historical documents, web pages, maps, charts, tables, and so on. And note-taking is writing, jotting down a brief description of every piece of information you gather from your reading so that it'll be easy to find, to think about, and perhaps refer to when you write your final paper a few days or weeks from now. In a very real sense, note-taking is the first stage in writing your research paper. In fact, you'll probably find that some of the phrases and sentences that you jot down during note-taking will end up appearing in your final paper. So note-taking isn't something to be rushed through. It's not about scribbling a couple of words or phrases on a torn-off piece of paper while you flip through the pages of a book, trying to get the job done as quickly as possible. Note-taking is about thinking through the meaning of what you're reading and then finding a way to encapsulate that meaning for future reference in a clear, accurate, useful form. Like all writing, note-taking is also a form of communication, even though you are probably the only person who will ever read your notes. In a sense, when you take notes, you are writing a message that is being sent to another person, namely yourself, 1 week, 1 month, or even longer from now, whenever you sit down to draft your research paper. So your notes must be complete, clear, understandable, and legible. They must record accurately not only what you read, but also why you find it interesting, important, useful, and relevant. When you look at your notes, you should be able to quickly recapture the value of the particular research source being described and see how the information it provides may fit into your paper. Preserving all these things in the form of a simple note isn't easy. It takes thought, skill, and practice. Now here's perhaps the single most important piece of advice we can offer about note-taking. As you do your reading, beware of saying to yourself, "Oh, I don't have to write down this idea or that fact. Those are obvious and important and easy, and I'll remember them without having to take a note." The truth is that a few days from now, you probably won't remember even what seems striking and unforgettable today. You'll be doing a lot of other reading between now and then, and the new information will tend to crowd out the old. So write a note, even if you think it isn't necessary. And make your note a detailed one. If the notes you take are too brief and too sketching, you probably won't be able to understand them when you look at them in a couple of weeks. The lesson: when in doubt, take a note and make it longer and more detailed than you think is necessary. Later on, when you prepare to draft your paper, you'll be glad you did. You should also cast a wide net as you do your reading and your note-taking. You probably have a fairly clear idea of the boundaries of your topic based on your preliminary research and the reading around the topic that you've done. But those boundaries may evolve as you research and write. Particular details or aspects of the topic that you might have thought were irrelevant may gradually take on importance as your understanding of the topic deepens and grows, while other areas may gradually drop away. So as you read, make notes of any item you think may be of interest, even when you're in doubt. If you take too many notes, the worst thing that will happen is that you'll end up discarding some of them as unnecessary. It's no big deal. But if you take too few notes, you may find yourself at 2 a.m. the night before your paper is due, trying desperately to locate a particular fact or quotation that you vaguely recall from some book or other and that you know would be the perfect way to begin or end your paper. But you can't use it because you failed to write it down. So taking too many notes is always better than taking too few. Before we talk about how to record the substance of what you read, let's talk about how you should keep track of your research sources. This is a simple but very important aspect of note-taking because if you do it right, it will be much easier to create accurate references, footnotes, and a bibliography for your research paper. Here's the process. Anytime you look at a book, article, web page, or any other source, jot down all the bibliographic information you'll need to refer to in your paper. Now, you can do this in a notebook or on your computer or on separate sheets of paper, but perhaps the best way to do it is with index cards. Simple 3x5 index cards like these. Index cards have lots of advantages when it comes to recording bibliographic information. They're small and easy to carry around. They can be shuffled, rearranged, sorted, and discarded. You can stick them in your pocket and bring them wherever you go. And when the time comes to create the final bibliography for your paper, you can alphabetize them and simply type the information directly from the cards. Now, for a book, here's what you need to record. First, the complete name of the author, last name first. That's a good way to write it down since it makes it easy to find the specific book later. Most scholars refer to books by the author's last name, a habit you might as well develop yourself. If a book has more than one author, write down all the names in the same order in which they appear in the book itself, not necessarily alphabetical order. Next, write down the title and subtitle of the book. Separate them by a colon, even though no punctuation mark is probably used on the book itself. A colon is the standard punctuation mark used to separate title and subtitle. If a book is a second or later edition, record that. Next, write down the place of publication, usually a city. If several cities are listed on the title page of the book, just copy down the first. If it's not a very well-known city, or if it's a city with the same name as some other city, then record the state or country where the city is located as well. For example, New York or London are well known and they can be listed just like that. But a town like Carbondale, Illinois, or Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, those need state names because they're not very famous or large. And there are many Springfields in several states, as well as 2 Cambridges, one in England and one in Massachusetts. Both Cambridges have famous universities and well-respected university presses. So if Cambridge is the place of publication, you would need to list the state or country for that city as well. Next, list the name of the publisher. Now, all the information we've mentioned so far is usually found on the title page of the book. The next piece of information is the date of publication, which is usually found not on the title page, but on the copyright page, which is the reverse or back of the title page. If there's more than one copyright date, you would normally use the date of the current edition, which is usually the most recent date listed. For example, let's say you're using a textbook, a reference work like an encyclopedia, or some other book that has been revised periodically. You would use the latest date on the copyright page, which covers the current edition. However, there are a couple of exceptions to this rule. If you're looking at a classic text that has been reprinted a number of times, you should record both the original date of publication and the date of the edition you're referencing. For example, Melville's novel Moby Dick has been published in many editions by many publishers. Each edition will have some different contents, for example, an editor's introduction or footnotes provided by the publisher. So when using a particular edition of Moby Dick, you would want to note both the original publication date of the novel, which is 1851, and also the publication date of the edition you're using, 2007 or whatever year it was published. Or when looking at an essay, chapter, poem, or story in an anthology, you should probably record both the original publication date of that item and the date of the book edition you're referencing. The more information you record at this point, the better. You can always make a decision later on as to which date is most relevant for the reference that you'll include in your paper. Also, it's useful to jot down on your bibliography card the library call number for future reference. In other words, the Library of Congress or Dewey Decimal Code number that's been assigned to the book. This is not needed for bibliographic purposes. You won't use the call number when you're creating the bibliography for your paper or when creating references or footnotes. But it will be useful to you in case you decide a week or two from now that you need to look up something in the same book. It'll make it easy for you to find the book in the library again without having to go to the catalog. So jot it down on your bibliography card. It's a handy piece of information to keep. Also jot down on the card the chapter and page numbers that you are finding most relevant to your topic, if there are particular parts of the book that are more helpful than others. Once again, this is just for your own reference. It'll make it easy for you to find the best parts of the book if you need to refer to it later. Let's take a look at what a typical bibliography card might look like. This would be a bibliography card created for this book, a book called Silent Covenants by Derek Bell, dealing with the civil rights movement and the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which eliminated school segregation. Here's what the card looks like. This is a bibliography card that you would keep in order to easily refer to this book in your paper. The first line gives us the author's name, last name first, Bell, comma, Derek. The next line gives us the title and subtitle of the book separated by a colon. Silent Covenants, colon, Brown versus Board of Education and the Unfulfilled Hopes for Racial Reform. Then we have the place of publication, Oxford. Oxford is in England, and it's the only well-known Oxford, so we don't need to list the state or country. Then the publisher, Oxford University Press, and the date of publication, 2004. The last line here contains the Library of Congress catalog number information to make it easy for us to find the book if we need to refer to it again, 344.73b. Since this book is authored by a man named Derek Bell, scholars would normally refer to it in a brief reference as Bell. Oh, there's a reference to that topic on page 135 of Bell, for example. So you can get used to calling books by the author's last name, and that's one of the reasons why we give the author's last name first on the card. When you're shuffling through your cards later, you can quickly find Bell just by going to the B's. Now, there are a number of variations on this basic bibliographic form. Different types of publications require some slightly different publishing information. For example, suppose a book has an editor or a translator along with an author or even in place of the author. In that case, you would record the editor or the translator's name. Let's take a look at a sample. Here's a book with an editor. It's a collection of speeches made by Malcolm X, and it's been edited by a man named Archie Epps. Here's what the bibliography card for this book would look like. The first line contains the name of the editor, Epps, comma, Archie, ed. Ed is our abbreviation for editor. If it were a translator, we could abbreviate that TRANS, period. Then the title, Malcolm X, colon, speeches at Harvard. Place of publication, New York. The publisher, Paragon House. The copyright date, 1991. And the Library of Congress catalog information, 320.54M. This is how you'd record the bibliographic information for a book with an editor. Here's a book that has more than one author and is in a second edition. The title of the book, The Craft of Research. There are 3 authors, and second edition is indicated on the top of the cover. Here's what the bibliography card might look like for this book. Booth, comma, Wayne C., Gregory G. Cullum, and Joseph M. Williams. Here we have all 3 authors listed, and notice just the first author is listed with last name first. The first author gets pride of place. His is the name by which we would refer to the book, so if we were talking about this book, we would say, look it up in Booth. And so his is the name which is reversed, where the last name appears first on the bibliography card. The other 2 names are given in the normal order, Gregory G. Cullum, Joseph M. Williams. When the time comes to create a bibliography for your paper, if you were to include this book, this is how the names would appear in the bibliography. Next, the title, the craft of research, and then the edition number, second edition. Place of publication is Chicago. The publisher is the University of Chicago Press. The date of publication is 2003. When we look on the copyright page for this book, we will see more than one copyright date. It says here, copyright 1995, 2003. 1995 was the date when the first edition was published. We're not concerned with that date. The only date we want is the date of the current edition, 2003. And finally, as usual, the Library of Congress cataloging information, 001.42b. Now, here's another variation on collecting bibliographic information. Suppose you're interested in just a single article, essay, poem, or other item that appears in an anthology or collection. You would start your bibliography card with the name of the author of the article, essay, poem, or whatever item you're using. Then you'd list the name of that item and follow this with complete bibliographic data for the entire book. Here's a sample of how that would work. It refers to a single article in this book titled Reporting Vietnam, American Journalism, 1959 to 1975. This is an anthology of newspaper and magazine articles written about the Vietnam War during the Vietnam War. And if we were doing research on that topic and we found one article in this book to be particularly interesting and relevant, here's how we would write up a bibliography card for that article. Take a look at this sample. The author of the article is Thomas A. Johnson, so he's listed first, last name first, Johnson, Thomas A. Next, the name of the article, The U.S. Negro in Vietnam. Now, what would come next would be the complete bibliographic information for the book as a whole. Now, for an anthology, you would normally list the name of the editor next. Normally, an anthology or other collection is edited by someone who would be given credit on the title page. But when we turn to the title page of this book, we find no editor is listed. It simply says, Reporting Vietnam, American Journalism, 1959 to 1975, and then the name of a person who wrote the introduction appears. Introduction by Ward Just. Now, elsewhere in the book, it explains that a panel of editors was involved in selecting the articles that appear in this anthology, which explains why no specific editor is listed. But in this case, unlike most anthologies, there is no one editor listed. So on the card, we've written in square brackets, no editor listed. That's the place where the editor's name would normally appear. And then we have the rest of the book information, as for most other books. The title of the book comes next, Reporting Vietnam, American Journalism, 1959 to 1975. The place of publication, New York. The publisher, the Library of America. The publication date, 1998. And the catalog information, 959.704. Notice that when an item which you normally would expect to appear in the bibliographic data, in this case the name of the editor, doesn't appear, write down that absence. In this case, we wrote no editor listed within square brackets. This way, when you use the card later, you won't have to wonder whether you simply forgot to write down the editor's name. You'll know for sure that no editor's name appeared in the book, and therefore that none should appear in any footnote or bibliographic item that you might do using this book. Now, suppose you use a periodical article that doesn't appear in a book or anthology, but that instead you have found simply in an issue of the periodical or perhaps online. The list of facts that you would jot down for a periodical article is a little different than the bibliographic facts for a book. Here are the items you need to jot down for a periodical article. First, the author of the article, then the title of the article, the title of the periodical, that is the newspaper, magazine, or journal, the volume and issue number, if any. This is especially relevant for scholarly journals. For most newspapers and magazines, you don't need the volume and issue number. Simply the date of the periodical would be enough. But if a volume or issue number is used, as with scholarly journals, indicate it next. Then the date of the periodical, and finally, the page number on which the article begins. Here's a sample bibliography card for a periodical article. This is an article that happened to appear in a newspaper. First, the author's name, Can, Peter R. Then the name of the article. A long, leisurely drive through Mekong Delta tells much of the war. This again is an article dealing with the war in Vietnam. Then the name of the periodical, the Wall Street Journal. the date of the periodical, November 10th, 1969, and the page on which the article began, page 1. Now, what if you're gathering information about a web page? The information you should record varies depending on the exact nature of the material. If you're using a web page that contains an archive of a printed publication, then you would need the same kinds of data that you would record for any periodical article. In other words, let's say that you go to the Wall Street Journal online or the online archive of any magazine or journal, and you find a relevant article there. Then you would capture all the same information that you would capture for any periodical article. In other words, the author of the article, the title of the article, the title of the periodical, the volume and issue number, if any, the date of the periodical, and the page number on which the article begins. And then, since you're working off a website, you would also add the web page address, also known as the URL. That's an abbreviation for Uniform Resource Locator. And the URL is simply that long, complicated string of numbers, characters, and punctuation marks that you always insert into a web browser in order to find a specific web page. Having the URL will enable anyone who reads your paper to find that web page, as long as it's still posted on the internet. Always remember, copy the URL very carefully. If you get a single character, space, or punctuation mark wrong, it will make the whole URL useless and frustrate anyone who is trying to recreate your own research. Here's a sample of what a bibliography card for an article found on a web page might look like. First, no author listed. Again, remember our rule that when a piece of information that you would normally expect to include is not given, you should always write down that it did not appear in your original source to clear up in your own mind any doubt as to whether the information was missing or simply you forgot to write it down. The article is titled Action in Tonkin Gulf. The name of the periodical, Time Magazine. The date of the periodical, August 14th, 1964. And here is the URL that tells us exactly where on the internet we found this article. http://www.time.com/magazine/article/0,91715,000.internalid=ACA. Notice that it's very important to get all of those characters right and to reproduce them precisely in your bibliography card and then later in the paper itself. Any mistake will invalidate the URL and make it impossible for someone else to follow up your research. This listing will enable anyone who's looking for the original article to find it on the internet or in printed form, because you've also given the name of the periodical and the date when the article appeared. So if someone happens to be at the library and has access to an old collection of Time magazines there, they can find the original printed article if that's more convenient. Now, what if you're referring to a web page that is not from a periodical archive? In other words, a web page that is simply part of an internet site that someone or some organization has put together to post relevant or interesting materials about a particular topic, but that is not tied to a particular newspaper, magazine, or journal. Here's the kind of information you need to jot down. Once again, the idea is to allow anyone who reads your paper to track down the website independently. For a website, jot down this information. First, the author of the article or other material that you're interested in. Next, the title of the article. Then, the date on which the article was posted, if available. On many websites, next to a particular article or item, they will indicate the date when that material was placed on the internet. And if that date is given, write it down. Remember, when we talked about evaluating research sources, we said that the more recent a source is, generally the more reliable and up-to-date and accurate it is assumed to be. That's why the date is important to capture. The fresher and newer the material, the better it's likely to be. So capture the date if one is given. Then, the name of the website. Now, the name of the website may not appear on the specific page that your research material is found on. You may have to click on the home page of the website, the index page, which is the first page that people are supposed to visit when they're browsing the site. Search for that home page, and usually you'll find at the top or sometimes at the bottom the name of the website. Write that down on your bibliographic card. Also capture the name of the organization sponsoring the site. Usually there is such an organization. It could be a university, a not-for-profit organization, a government agency, or a corporation that has created the site and is responsible for its contents. That may also be important in evaluating how reliable the research material is. And a company, for example, could be expected to have a vested interest in getting certain types of information out and perhaps suppressing information that is not favorable to the company. So you would need to take that information, perhaps with a grain of salt, depending on possible bias that the organization might have. So capturing the name of the organization that sponsors the site is also important. Like the name of the website, this may not appear on every page. Instead, it may only appear on the home page. So you may need to cruise the website a bit to find the name of the organization that sponsors the site. And finally, capture the URL of the web page. If possible, capture the URL of the specific page that you are relying upon. If for any reason that's not possible, then capture the URL of the home page of the website. And someone who is trying to recreate your research can usually navigate from that page to the specific page that you're referring to. Here's a sample bibliographic card for a website reference. It begins, "No author or editor listed." For this particular web document, an author or editor is not listed, although it becomes obvious in a moment who authored or created the material being referred to. Here's the title of the item, President Johnson's Message to Congress, August 5th, 1964. Once again, we're dealing with research about the war in Vietnam, and we can see that this particular web page contained the text of a speech given by President Johnson to Congress about the war in Vietnam in August of 1964. So clearly that's the author of the work, although no author was technically listed. No posting date was also listed. And once again, we've written this down on our bibliographic card within square brackets so that it'll be clear to us in later use of this card that we didn't simply overlook the posting date. No, we searched for it and we found there was no posting date indicated. Next, the name of the website, Documents in Law, History, and Diplomacy. The organization sponsoring the website, the Avalon Project at Yale Law School. And finally, the URL, http://www.yale.edu/lawweb/avalon/avalon.htm. That's a little shorter and easier URL, but once again, getting every character right is very important. Now, as you can see from all the examples we've looked at so far, the precise array of bibliographic information that you'll need to record will vary from one type of material to another. A book, a periodical article, a web page, all require slightly different types of information. If you use some other type of research source, something that's extremely unusual, you may need to consult with your teacher as to what data are required. And there are also a number of reference books that offer specific guidelines about bibliographic data. Practices do vary slightly from one field to another. Bibliographies in the natural sciences, for example, use a slightly different set of data than in the humanities. But the basic principle is very clear. You need to capture and record whatever information would be needed by someone who reads your paper in the future and wants to track down the original sources to read them. It's all part of the culture of scholarship in which every contribution to the world of knowledge is built on previous contributions. Clear citation data makes it possible for future students to review and learn from the sources that you relied upon. And that's why it's important to capture it as you work your way through your research. Now it's time to talk about substantive note-taking, the best methods for recording information from the materials you read so that information can be used later when you draft your paper. Now, no two students will take notes in exactly the same way. And as you progress through your academic career, you may well find that your note-taking system will change over time. It may also vary from one project to the next, and as fields in which you do research may change, then your note-taking processes may also change. Nonetheless, there are certain basic principles of note-taking that everyone should know about and strive to practice. Here's the first principle to know, probably the most important one. Note-taking is not about gathering raw material and dumping it on paper for later study. It's about reading, analyzing, thinking about, and digesting information as you read, and then capturing that information in a form that will make it easy to use later on. This means that you should be working to interpret and understand the books, articles, and other materials you're reading as you take notes. So rather than trying to capture everything an author says for your analysis later, your note-taking should be selective and should focus on ideas that relate specifically to your topic. Note-taking, then, is not a mindless exercise of simply trying to grab everything from what you're reading and get it down on paper. No, it's about reading, analyzing, thinking it through, and then selectively capturing the most useful, interesting, and relevant bits of data and putting them down on your note cards. Now, one way to gauge whether or not your note-taking is appropriately detailed is simply by looking at the sheer volume. Suppose you're reading a 15-page article that's relevant to your paper. If you find yourself jotting down notes that are the equivalent of 8 to 10 pages, you're probably going overboard. You're running the risk of relying so heavily on this one source that your paper will hardly be an original piece of work. Or you may be jotting down so much extraneous information that the few truly useful items will be lost in a flood of irrelevant facts. 2 to 3 pages would probably be a more appropriate volume of notes from a single 15-page article. In the same way, let's say you found a book that's very useful for your research. 6 to 15 pages of notes on a single book would probably be an appropriate amount. If you found yourself jotting down 30 to 50 pages of notes, that would almost certainly be overkill. Having said this, what kinds of facts and ideas should you try to capture in your note-taking? The exact answer, of course, will depend on your topic and on the slant of the paper that you're writing. But as a general rule, your notes should try to capture 2 things. First, facts that are not common knowledge and that help to answer the key question on which your paper is focused, either strengthening, weakening, clarifying, or modifying your working thesis. And ideas, that is, interpretations, opinions, analyses, or theories that are relevant to your question and your working thesis, and with which you either agree or disagree. Notice the distinction that we're drawing between facts and ideas. It's an important one. Facts are statements that everyone who studies or thinks about a given topic can agree upon. Facts can be verified or proved in a number of ways. Scientific facts, for example, may be verified through experiments or by deduction from physical evidence, such as the measurements of the distances of stars or the appearance of fossils that a geologist might discover in the Earth. Historical facts can be verified by, for example, studying documents or by interviewing eyewitnesses or examining other kinds of evidence, for example, artifacts like buildings or tools or weapons. Facts about works of art can usually be verified by use of our senses. So, for example, you can read the text of a novel to verify what it says. If someone says that a particular novel refers to London, you could look through the book and see whether the name London actually appears, and that would verify as a fact whether or not that's true. You could examine a painting to verify what it looks like, or listen to a piece of music to verify the sounds it contains. All of these are kinds of facts. They can be verified or proven, and everyone who is studying a particular field can come to an agreement as to which facts are true and which ones are not. Ideas, on the other hand, are quite different. They can't be absolutely proven or verified, and therefore they're subject to disagreement. Now, sometimes ideas can't be verified simply because evidence is lacking. Here's an example. No one knows for sure who the 19th century murderer known as Jack the Ripper was. He terrorized London in the late years of the 19th century, killed a number of people, caused quite a panic, and to this day, no one knows for sure who he was. The reason? The London police never came up with clear evidence as to who committed the crimes. Many historians have written about Jack the Ripper, and some of them have come up with ideas about who he might have been, but these are theories, not facts. In other words, we're in the realm of ideas rather than facts that can be proved or verified. Now, other ideas can never be verified no matter what evidence is ever found. And these are opinions, interpretations, or theories about facts, which can be viewed in more than one way. So these are ideas which could never be verified or proved one way or the other, no matter how much evidence might someday be discovered, because they're simply not subject to being proven. Now, here's an example. It is a fact that Charles Darwin, the famous naturalist, developed his theory of evolution by natural selection around the year 1838. We can verify this fact by looking at Darwin's notebooks, which are all dated, and in which he wrote in detail about his ideas as he developed them. So by reading the notebooks that he wrote in 1837, 1838, and 1839, we can see for a fact that he did have the idea of natural selection around that time. It's also a fact that Darwin did not present his theory in public until 20 years later, July 1858, when he and another scientist named Alfred Russel Wallace gave a joint presentation in a speech before a learned society in which they first presented the ideas that they had independently developed. So we can verify this fact, that is, the fact that Darwin did not publicly present his theory until 20 years after he developed it. We can verify it by reading, for example, contemporary accounts of the speech. Many people were present at the speech and wrote about it. So we know for a fact that Darwin gave that speech and that it was the first time he ever presented the theory of evolution. But when we consider the question of why Darwin delayed so long to publish his theory, now we leave the realm of facts and we move into the realm of ideas. Now, on the surface, it was a strange thing for Darwin to do, to wait 20 years before presenting his theory. Most scientists who work for years to create a new theory are eager to publish it as soon as possible and get the credit for it, perhaps launch a debate, get other scientists to verify their thinking, and perhaps win fame or even fortune by becoming known as the scientist who developed a particular important theory. So most scientists would publish as soon as possible. Darwin didn't do this, and no one really knows why. He never actually explained his motivation for delaying, and of course, we also know, just from our experience of human beings, that sometimes people don't fully understand the reasons behind their own behavior. There have probably been things you've done in your life that you can't really explain exactly why you did it. So even if Darwin were to have offered an explanation for his delay, we wouldn't necessarily have to accept it as the whole truth. So the reason for Darwin's delay is not in the realm of fact, but rather in the realm of ideas, about which there could be room for much disagreement. Historians who have studied the life of Darwin have actually offered a number of theories for his delay. Some blame it on his poor health. Others say that he wanted more time to gather evidence to support the theory before he publicly presented it. Still others say that Darwin was afraid to face the controversy that he knew his theory would cause, and a few have said that he had a great sense of guilt because he feared that the theory of evolution challenged traditional religious ideas about the origin of life on Earth. All of these are different psychological explanations that historians have offered as to why Darwin might have delayed publishing his theory. None of these interpretations can ever be completely proven. We can't go back in time, ask Darwin, and force him to tell us the whole truth as to why he acted as he did. All of these theories are supported by some evidence, things he may have said or written in his diaries. All of them also are weakened by some other evidence. So that's why historians battle about these interpretations to this day, and no one is sure which interpretation is right. Perhaps some other theory, other than the ones that have already been raised, is in fact the correct one. All of these are ideas, not facts. So that's the distinction that needs to be drawn between facts and ideas. Facts can be proved, can be verified, and agreement can be reached on facts among all the people studying a particular field, whereas ideas can't be proved and probably can never be the subject of general agreement. Now, both facts and ideas have an important place in research and in the research papers that you write. In fact, you really need both facts and ideas to write a really first-rate research paper. If you were to write a paper that contained nothing but facts, that is, verifiable information that everyone could agree upon, it would probably be boring and not very original. You could certainly look up all kinds of facts in reference books and write a paper that regurgitates those facts, but it wouldn't be very interesting work and wouldn't really deserve a high grade as a research paper. So a paper containing nothing but facts isn't really very good. On the other hand, a paper that contains nothing but ideas, that's not really very good either. It would probably be weak and unconvincing to simply present a bunch of theories without any facts to back them up. That kind of paper would be just a lot of hot air with no substance behind it. A really great research paper is one that offers interesting, significant ideas that are supported by powerful, compelling facts. So, when you're reading and making notes for your research paper, look for both facts and ideas. Interesting, little-known facts that will help to support the fascinating ideas that you want to present in your paper. The purpose of note-taking is to capture the best of both, facts and ideas that you could possibly want to use in your paper. Now, as we've mentioned, no two students use exactly the same note-taking techniques. But through experimentation, scholars have developed a number of note-taking methods that have proven to be very effective. Here's a rundown of these alternative techniques with a look at the upside and downside of each. One technique is to make photocopies of the most relevant pages from sources that you're using, books, articles, and other documents. In the case of internet sources, you can print a copy of the relevant web page or the portion of it that you're interested in. Now, what is the upside of this technique? One is that you get to reread the original source material later. If you make a photocopy and bring it home with you, you'll always have it to refer to, which is handy. It's especially useful for materials that can't be removed from the library, items that are in the reference collection or for any other reason are not permitted to circulate. You can also, when you are working with photocopies, mark up the documents using a highlighter or a pen to indicate key words, phrases, or sentences, and write notes in the margin to capture your own thoughts and reactions. Obviously, you can't do this with an original article or a book that belongs to a library, for example, so working with photocopies makes that easy. And finally, working with hard copies makes it easy to avoid accidental plagiarism. If you have a copy of the original source in front of you as you write your paper, you can easily see by looking at that printed page exactly what words the source said and make certain that you don't copy the same sentences inadvertently. Those are all the upsides, then, of working with photocopies. Here's the downside. Photocopying is a tempting substitute for reading, analyzing, and thinking. It's very easy to spend a few hours in the library and grab a bunch of books and articles that look relevant to your topic, and then print out a bunch of copies to take home and say, well, that was a good day of work in the library. The problem is that you have to do the hard work of actually reading and studying the sources eventually. And if you spend your time copying documents without first reading and analyzing them, you may find when you get home that you've wasted your time copying a bunch of materials that weren't really relevant. They may have looked relevant based on the title or a quick skim, but when you actually read the document, you find, it's really not that helpful. Or you may find when you get home that you've missed a whole bunch of other materials that would have been much more useful. So simply mindlessly photocopying things, which some students get into the habit of doing in the library, can actually lead you astray and lead to less effective research rather than more effective. Therefore, if you do use photocopying, which you may want to do even in combination with the other strategies we're going to describe, here are some techniques to use when you do photocopy. First, always label your copies as soon as you create them so that they can be easily identified later. For example, if you photocopy a page from a book, write the name of the author and the book title right in the margin of the copy so that you can easily match it later to the corresponding bibliography card. Otherwise, you might end up with piles of papers that you can't identify, worthless pieces of paper rather than valuable source materials. And more important, be sure to read and study the materials before you decide whether or not to photocopy them. Don't spend your time in the library simply standing over the photocopy machine, mindlessly making copies of documents. Instead, sit down at a table, read through your stack of articles and books, identify which ones are truly valuable, which parts of them are interesting and useful, and then if you want to, go ahead and photocopy the most useful materials. Don't allow photocopying to become a substitute, even a temporary one, for actual reading and study. A second note-taking technique is using sticky notes to mark the most relevant pages from source materials. In the case of web pages, of course, this would require printing out hard copies to which the sticky notes could then be attached. You're probably familiar with these kinds of sticky notes, which are widely available in stationery stores. They're a wonderful invention because unlike old notes which might have been held on with glue or tape, they can easily be removed from documents without damaging them. So you can even use them on books or articles that you borrow from the library without harming the original materials. So sticky notes are indeed a wonderful technological marvel, and some people like to use them as part of their note-taking process. The upside of using sticky notes is that, as with photocopies, you get to reread the original source materials. If you bring the books home from the library and you use sticky notes to highlight the most important pages, then you can read the original source as many times as you want, and that can be quite useful. Sticky notes let you highlight and even comment on materials from a library book without damaging it, because there's a little bit of space here, and you can write a few words on the note itself to highlight particular concepts or ideas that you most want to capture or mention. There is a downside to using sticky notes. You can only use this strategy with materials that can be removed from the library. It won't work with reference materials or anything else that doesn't circulate. You'd have to go ahead and photocopy the materials before you could take them home. So in a sense, you'd be combining two techniques. And if you have a dozen or more pages marked in a book with sticky notes, you may find that you end up wasting a lot of time flipping through the pages in search of a particular note about a single fact that you're most interested in referring to. Just having 20 or 30 of these sticking out from the pages can be a little less helpful than you might think. So if you do use sticky notes, again, you may use them in combination with other strategies, consider getting several colors of notes and using different colors to represent different aspects of your research. Once again, technologically, the sticky note has come a long way and is now available in any number of colors. So let's say, for example, that you were researching the way art critics responded to Picasso's painting Guernica when it was first painted in the 1930s. As we've discussed elsewhere in this series, Picasso's painting has a lot of political content, and so many art critics responded to the painting based on their own political views of the theme that Picasso was painting about. Let's say you were studying a collection of writings by art critics about the works of Picasso, and you wanted to use sticky notes to highlight certain pages that you wanted to refer to. Well, you could use green notes to mark references to critics who liked Picasso's painting. You could use pink notes to mark the critics who disliked the painting, and yellow notes to mark critics who were neutral. And that way, if you are working on your paper and you want to quickly find all the negative critics, you can quickly turn just to the pink notes and know that you're not wasting time looking at irrelevant ones. You can also, of course, jot brief comments of a word or two on the outside of the notes to make it easier to find a specific item. So sticky notes can be handy when it comes to note-taking, provided you use these techniques to make the notes more specific and easier to track down. Now, perhaps the best way of taking notes is by using index cards. This is a classic technique that many scholars recommend. The upside of using index cards is enormous. As we've already noted, index cards are easy to carry. You can wrap a rubber band around a stack of them and put them in a pocket, a backpack, or purse. When you have a few minutes to think about your research, let's say you're on the bus or train or in study hall, for example, you can pull out the cards and review, shuffle, or reorganize them. So it's a very easy way to bring your work with you, and whenever you have a few minutes to spend on it, have your materials to read and think about. Because the index cards are small, each one can be devoted to a single fact or idea. And when you want to compare ideas or find new ways to combine or organize them, you can spread out all your cards on a table or a desk, the bed or the floor, and scan all of them at once and move them around to make the connections among them clear. So index cards are useful in a lot of ways. Now, there is some downside. Index cards may be too small for some notes. There may be a time when you want to write out quite a bit of information about a particular page in your research. And if your handwriting is large or your eyes are bad, you may find that a 3x5 index card doesn't really give you enough space to make a complete note. If you find this to be a problem, you could consider switching from the traditional 3x5 index card to larger ones, which come in 4x6 or 5x8. Those larger cards should provide ample space for most notes, and they would still allow you to shuffle them, reorganize them, spread them out, and have all the other advantages that index cards provide. Now, if you do use index cards, we recommend putting a header on the top of each card. The header is a few words that will help you organize and find the cards and keep track of what each card is about. The header includes one or more keywords, which suggest the main theme or point of the note on the card. It should also include the last name of the author whose work is being referenced. And if you want, you can also include a short version of the title of the work. This may be especially important if the same author has written 2 or more works that you've come upon in your research and you need to distinguish between those 2 books. And finally, put the page or page numbers that you're referring to. Here's a sample index card showing what a note might look like. This card contains a note based on an article from this book about reporting Vietnam. The article is titled "The U.S. Negro in Vietnam," written by Thomas A. Johnson, and it appeared in the New York Times in 1968. It's an article that might be relevant for someone who was researching a paper dealing with, let's say, the role of the military in helping to end racial segregation in America. Now, when reading this book, and reading that particular article, the person doing this research found that there were a couple of interesting facts in the article that they wanted to capture so they could refer to them in their paper. Here's what the card might look like. It begins with a header, and there are 2 keywords shown here, Vietnam and opportunity. Next, the name of the author of the article, Johnson, and then the page number, page 350. And what follows is the note that captures the information from the article that the person doing the research found useful. Here's how it reads. Black soldiers, like white, saw Vietnam as an opportunity to serve. Army pay was higher than in U.S. Also, blacks found that they suffered no discrimination in Vietnam. Quote, "The man can't overlook talent when he wants the job done," said Staff Sergeant James Frost, a 29-year-old Negro from Youngstown, Ohio. Close quote. Vietnam and opportunity are the keywords that appear at the top of the card, and these 2 words would help us find the note when we're interested in drafting the part of our paper that deals with those topics. Let's say we have found in our research that a number of American wars, Vietnam, World War II, the Gulf War, are referred to in various articles and books. We might label several cards Vietnam, others Gulf War, others World War II, and when we're writing about each of those conflicts, we can quickly find all the cards that deal with Vietnam. And the theme of opportunity offered by the military to African Americans would be another theme that a number of articles and books might refer to. If we decide that one portion of our paper is going to deal with that theme of opportunity, labeling all those cards in the header with the word opportunity would make it easy to find all the relevant cards when it comes time to draft that part of the paper. Notice in our note we've used abbreviations like OPPTY to stand for opportunity, which saves time and energy. Whenever you take notes in class, you probably use abbreviations and symbols, and you can do the same thing with notes that you write in your research. As long as your abbreviations are clear and understandable to you, that's fine. Notice also that one quotation from the original article has been written down to capture a particularly striking and colorful sentence that we might want to use in our paper. We'll be discussing in a moment exactly how and when to use direct quotations. The key thing is to be sure to mark all direct quotations clearly and capture them accurately. In this case, we've put quotation marks at the beginning and end of the quotation from the article, so there can't be any mistake as to whether or not it's a quotation. Now, some students prefer to use one or more notebooks rather than index cards. So that's another note-taking technique that some students prefer. Each notebook page can be set up much like an index card. You can use a header with keywords, author title references, and page numbers. What's the upside and the downside to using a notebook instead of index cards? Well, the upside is that, like index cards, notebooks are easily portable. You can stick them in a bag and carry them wherever you go. Notebook pages, of course, are usually larger than index cards, so there's more room for notes. If you like to take voluminous notes, you might prefer notebook pages. And since a notebook normally contains many pages, you can easily devote one page to each note. There is a downside, however. Unless you tear out the notebook pages, you're stuck with whatever sequence of ideas the notes happen to follow. You'll probably take the notes starting on page 1 and keep going right on through. And as the ideas flow, you may find that the same ideas or themes or topics appear in various places in the notebook. If you end up with notes related to one particular theme on pages 5, 13, 24, and 29 of your notebook, then you're going to have to flip back and forth a lot when trying to compare ideas or draft part of your paper that deals with all those notes. The index card advantage is being able to rearrange them at will and spread them out on the table in front of you, keep everything visible at one time. If you do use a notebook, consider using different colored pens to distinguish different subtopics or different themes. That's one way of making it quicker or easier to find specific themes or ideas when you need to. If you know that everything dealing with Vietnam is in the color green, you can more quickly and easily find the relevant notebook pages. Finally, some students like using the computer for note-taking. Here's the upside. Typing, which is, of course, how you enter information into the computer, may end up being neater and more legible than handwriting. Although, a warning, typos can be very confusing in their own right. It's very easy when you're typing to skip a letter or miss a letter or put the wrong character in, and that can be a fatal problem with certain kinds of typing. If you're typing numbers and dates, for example, it's so easy to accidentally type 1978 instead of 1987 and end up totally confusing your research. So if you are typing, yes, it may end up being neater than your messy handwriting, but on the other hand, be very careful about typos. When you enter material into your computer, it's easy to move sentences, paragraphs, and other elements quickly and easily from one place to another. And you can quickly copy and change elements from your notes, although all of these steps must be taken with extreme care for reasons we'll describe in a moment. Furthermore, another advantage or upside of using the computer is that internet pages or files can be saved in their original form in your computer's memory. So if you find a web page that's particularly valuable or a document on the internet that's quite useful, you can save it in your computer and again refer to it days or weeks later. And finally, if you want to use sentences or paragraphs from your notes directly in your paper, then you can easily cut and paste them from your notes into the paper itself. All of these are advantages of using the computer. However, there are definite downsides as well. For one thing, you'll need to have a laptop if you want to use the computer in the library. There are usually computers available in most libraries, but you won't be able to take those files home with you. You might be able to send them to yourself over the internet, but then you run the risk of losing them or misplacing those particular files. So having your own laptop to bring to the library is almost a necessity, and not everyone owns a laptop computer. Furthermore, computer files can easily get lost or corrupted or destroyed. And inadvertent plagiarism is easy to commit because cutting and pasting is so easy to do. We mentioned that the ease with which you can move materials around on the computer is a definite upside of taking notes this way, but it's also a definite downside. There have even been some famous historians who have suffered serious embarrassment when they accidentally cut and pasted quotations from their research into books that they were writing and failed to notice until the books had already been published. It appeared as though the historians had deliberately stolen material from other writers. That wasn't their intention at all. It was simply an accidental byproduct of the ease with which cutting and pasting can be done. So if you do use the computer, you need to be very careful about that. If you use a computer for your note-taking, then, follow these suggestions. First, create and organize files by subtopics. Second, name and rename files as needed so that as your research evolves, you won't have to keep opening up files to remind yourself of their contents. So, for example, let's say you're researching a particular topic and using the computer to keep your notes. You'll probably want to create a folder related to the entire topic, and then within the folder have several files, each of which covers a particular theme or subtopic related to the overall topic. You can then cut and paste notes directly into each of those files and change the names as you go, so it's always easy for you to remember what file deals with which topic. Next, be sure to save your work. Hit the save button at least once every 5 minutes. Computers have a way of going on the blink, and when that happens, you may lose your work if you haven't saved it frequently. And finally, back up your files on a separate hard drive, disk, or internet site so that if your computer gets lost or damaged or stolen, your work won't be destroyed. There's nothing more heartbreaking than to discover that work you've been doing over the last several weeks is totally lost simply because you misplaced your computer or something happened to the hard drive. So if you use your computer, that's fine. It's a wonderfully powerful tool, but also be very careful how you use it. It's easy to get into trouble using computers, which is why many scholars, even in today's computer-happy era, still prefer the good old-fashioned technique of using index cards. It's a little more laborious, but the results can be a little more reliable. Now, no matter what note-taking strategy you use, that is, whether you use index cards or notebooks or the computer or any other strategy, you'll probably end up creating 3 different kinds of notes: direct quotations, paraphrases, and comments of your own. All 3 of these kinds of notes are useful and important, and sometimes all 3 will even be combined in a single note, as we'll see. But distinguishing among all 3 is very important. This is a crucial element in avoiding inadvertent plagiarism, especially when you're using a computer for any part of the note-taking process where cutting and pasting is so easy to do. Here's a look at each of these 3 kinds of notes with some suggestions about how to use each one appropriately. Let's start with direct quotations. First, an observation. Many students tend to use too many direct quotations when they start working on research papers. Remember our definition of a research paper. It's a piece of original work expressing your own ideas. It's not a collection of thoughts borrowed from other writers. To make sure that your paper is written in your own voice and expresses your own ideas, avoid copying long sections from your research sources. Instead, quote only a sentence or 2 or perhaps a paragraph when the phrasing of the original research source is distinctive, memorable, or especially powerful. Now, when you do quote directly, it's important to copy the quotation precisely. Even recreate typos, odd spellings, unusual punctuation or capitalization, or other things that might look wrong. These are especially important when you're copying from primary sources, for example, writings from hundreds of years ago when the English language was different than it is today, or quotations from letters or diaries that are written perhaps by semi-educated people. Be careful not to write down what you think the source says. Read it word for word very carefully so you don't accidentally change, omit, or add a word or a punctuation mark. All of those things are very easy to do. If you're presenting it as a direct quotation in your notes and ultimately in your paper, it's got to be exactly the same as the original source. Now, occasionally you may find that you'll need to add a word or phrase to clarify the meaning of something that's in the quotation. For example, there may be a reference to a person or a thing that's clear in the original context, the original book or article, but which is not clear when you look at just one paragraph or one sentence. When you do this, when you add a word or phrase to clarify something, put the word or phrase that you add inside square brackets, not ordinary parentheses, but square brackets. This way you'll know that the word or phrase was not in the original source. And conversely, if you decide to leave out part of the quotation, let's say a few words from the middle, or you decide you have a paragraph from the original source that's very interesting, but there are a few sentences in the middle that are irrelevant. If you want to leave out parts of the quotation, you use 3 spaced periods, which is known as ellipses, to show exactly where the words have been omitted. And finally, whenever you do write a note that contains a direct quotation from your source, be sure to write down the number of the specific page in the book or article where the quotation comes from. And if the quotation runs from one page onto the next, use a slash mark in the middle of the quotation to show where the page break occurs. Here's an example of the right way to quote a source. This is a quotation drawn from the book Malcolm X, Speeches at Harvard, and it's drawn from a talk about political activism that Malcolm X gave toward the end of his life. Here's what our note card looks like. It begins with a header, political activism, which is the key word telling us what topic this particular note card deals with. Then we have the author's name, EPS, and a brief version of the title, speeches, and the pages 181 to 182. And here's the quote. We've got it in quotation marks, and let's read how it reads on the note card. We, black Americans, go into politics in a sort of gullible way, where politics in this country is cold-blooded and heartless. We need a better understanding of the science of politics, as well as becoming registered voters. And then we should not take sides either / way. We should reserve political action for the situation at hand, in no way identifying with either political party, the Democrats or the Republicans, or selling ourselves to either party, close quotes. Okay, the quotation marks at the beginning and the end show you clearly that everything within the quotation marks is quoted directly and exactly from the book. Notice near the beginning the use of square brackets. These are used to mark the words that we added to clarify the meaning of the source. The sentence by itself says, we go into politics in a sort of gullible way. Now, who or what does this refer to? Who is Malcolm X referring to when he says we? Well, from the context in the original book, you can tell that he's referring to black Americans. So in order to make it clear for our own use and for readers of our paper later on, we need to put in the words black Americans to indicate who we refers to. So we put them in within square brackets to make it clear this is not what Malcolm X himself said. The words black Americans are being added by us. And also notice the use of the / mark to show where the break between pages occurred in the original source. The original source ran from page 181 onto page 182, and the / mark in our card between the words either and way shows that that's where page 181 ended and page 182 began. This way, let's say we decide in our final paper that we just want to quote the last sentence here, the one that begins, we should reserve political action for the situation at hand. If we just want to quote that, by looking at our card, we can know that we are simply quoting material from page 182. Page 181 is not involved at all. So knowing exactly where the page break occurs is important so that your footnote, citation, or bibliographic reference in your final paper can accurately reflect what you're actually quoting in the paper itself. So when a quotation runs from one page onto the next, indicate in your notes exactly where the page break occurs. Now, in most cases, paraphrasing is a better choice than direct quotation. As I've indicated, most students probably make too many direct quotes in their notes. Instead, paraphrasing is a better choice in most cases. This means completely rewriting your source from the ground up, not keeping some phrases and changing others. When you paraphrase, you want to absorb the meaning of the source and then restate it precisely and accurately, but totally in your own words. If one or a few words from the original source are worthy of being quoted directly because they're particularly striking or apt or unusual or interesting, that's fine. Go ahead and quote them and put them in quotation marks in your note. But the rest of your note, which simply paraphrases or summarizes what's in your source, should be written entirely in your own words. Now, what does this mean and how does it work? Well, let's look at an example. Here's a book called Justice for All. It's a biography of Earl Warren, who was Chief Justice of the United States. And it contains an anecdote that describes an event that occurred while the Supreme Court was considering the famous 1954 case, Brown versus Board of Education, which ultimately outlawed school segregation in the United States. We've referred to this anecdote elsewhere in this series. In the book, Justice for All, the author Jim Newton writes the following about something that happened during the deliberations on the Brown versus Board of Education case. And here's what he actually wrote in his book. As the justices discussed the segregation cases together in conference and in smaller groups of 2 and 3, Warren found time for a short retreat. He arranged with his chauffeur, a black man, to go on an overnight tour of Southern Civil War monuments outside Washington, D.C. They headed south through Virginia, touring various sites. As afternoon slipped into evening, Warren asked his driver to stop at a local hotel for the night. The two made arrangements for the driver to pick Warren up in the morning, and then Warren went inside to register, not really paying attention as his driver shrank back. Perhaps, Warren thought distractedly, he was heading for a cheaper place to stay for the night. The following morning, when the chauffeur came to pick Warren up, it was clear to the Chief Justice that the driver had spent the night in the car. "What happened?" Warren asked. "Didn't you go to a hotel? Have you slept here all night?" "Well, Mr. Chief Justice," the driver replied hesitatingly, "I just couldn't find a place to..." Listening to his chauffeur's halting reply, it suddenly dawned on Warren that he had brought a man to a town that would not allow him a room, that the personal assistant of the Chief Justice of the United States was not worthy of a bed in a segregated hamlet within a day's drive of the nation's capital. I was embarrassed, Warren recalled, near the end of his life. I was ashamed. We turned back immediately. Okay, let's say you're researching a paper dealing with how the Brown versus Board of Education decision was made, and you come upon this story and you think this offers an interesting insight into a personal experience that might have affected Warren's decision in this case. And you decide it's important to capture this story for possible reference in your paper. Here would be the wrong way to paraphrase it on a note card. Here's the note card. It begins with keywords segregation and Brown, the author's name Newton, the title of the book Justice, and then pages 303, 304. Here's a first attempt at a paraphrase. As justices discussed segregation cases, Warren took short retreat, overnight tour of Southern Civil War monuments. Warren asked his black driver to stop at local hotel for night. Following morning, it was clear driver had spent night in car. It suddenly dawned on Warren that his personal assistant was not worthy of a bed in a segregated hamlet. Now, do you see what's wrong with this note card? Rather than rewriting the source, the author of this note has actually condensed it, leaving out a few words and phrases here and there, but keeping most of the verbiage intact. If you compare this note to the original source, you can see lots of the same words and phrases are being repeated word for word. Now, not only is this lazy, but it may cause an apparent case of plagiarism. If the note-taker inserts this summary into his paper and expands the language slightly, adding a word here and there to make it sound better, it will probably end up sounding almost exactly like the original, which is a real no-no. And if the teacher checks against the original source or happens to have read the book, the teacher may think, oh, my student has just stolen a couple of paragraphs from the book, stuck them into the paper, and has committed plagiarism. So that's the danger of doing a lazy paraphrase which uses a lot of words and phrases from the original source. Here would be the right way to paraphrase the same source material. Once again, we have the same header, and here is how this student has paraphrased the story using his or her own words. During Brown deliberations, Warren took overnight tour of southern battlefields of Civil War. He stayed in a Virginia hotel, but his driver, who was black, couldn't find a hotel room to stay in. In the morning, Warren realized the driver had spent the night in the car. Late in life, Warren remembered the incident and said it made him feel, quote, embarrassed and, quote, ashamed. Notice that in this note, only the two words embarrassed and ashamed have been drawn directly from the original text. All the rest has been completely rewritten with no phrases or sentences borrowed. That means that if we want, we could actually use this paraphrase directly in our research paper without any chance of accidentally committing plagiarism. So the lesson is this. Paraphrasing is a very good way of taking notes. It means reading reference source, and when you find material that you want to use in your paper, you write your own version of it on the note card. But it's very important to paraphrase properly, not to simply condense the original source, leaving out words and phrases, but otherwise following the source precisely. Don't do that. Instead, rewrite it thoroughly from the ground up so that it's all in your own words. And then you'll have material you can use directly in your paper if you so choose. Now, the third kind of note, besides direct quotation and paraphrase, is a comment of your own. And this is an idea that you might have about how the source material that you're making notes about is relevant to your paper. Your comment might serve as a reminder to you about how you want to use the source material in your paper. It might indicate how or why you agree or disagree with the source, or it might raise a question for further study and research. When you put a comment on one of your note cards, you want to be sure you can clearly differentiate it from your quotation or your paraphrase of the research source. Otherwise, later when you're looking at the cards, you may become confused about which ideas came from your source and which ones are your own. Once again, you run into the possible danger of attributing something to a source that actually was your idea, which would make you look very silly. Now, you could make your comments in a different colored ink. That would be one way of differentiating them. Or you could simply enclose your personal comments inside a circle or a set of square brackets to show that these are things you have stuck in yourself. For example, suppose you wanted to add a comment to the note card that we saw a few minutes ago dealing with the issue of segregation and the story of Earl Warren and his driver and the Supreme Court's Brown decision. You could add the comment right inside square brackets on the very same note card, and it would look something like this. Here we have much the same note card, but at the bottom, within square brackets, we've added a comment. Shows role that personal experiences played in Warren's legal judgments. That's a reminder as to why we found this story interesting and what we might want to say about it when we include it in our paper. It's our own thought. It doesn't come up in the original source. It's our idea, so we put it in square brackets to make it clear. This is not something that the author Jim Newton wrote. It's our own concept, and we'll want to make it clear which is which when we write the actual paper. Once again, no two students are going to create notes that are exactly the same, and that's fine. The important thing is to develop your own system that works for you and for the paper you're creating. Experiment with different techniques. Use notebooks, use cards, use your computer, and combine one or more methods of note-taking if you like. Sometimes photocopying and sticky notes can be a useful adjunct to using index cards for most of your notes. Just make sure that you keep all your sources clear so that there's no room for confusion. Be sure that you paraphrase appropriately and that you are clear about which items are your own comments versus materials drawn from sources. Soon you'll find yourself with an impressive collection of notes drawn from many information sources. Your brain will also be buzzing with interesting facts and ideas, all jostling for a place in your research paper. But how do you go about turning this mass of disconnected data into the first draft of a paper which will be well organized, clear, and persuasive? As you might imagine, that's an art in itself, and we'll begin to examine it in the next program in this series. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.
If math problems leave you scratching your head, unsure of where to start and where to go, don't worry. Video-aided instruction can help even the most math-challenged students excel. Whether you're taking math in middle school, high school, or college, or simply brushing up on those forgotten skills, our comprehensive DVD review sets are the ultimate supplements to your textbook and classwork. We have programs for a whole range of skill levels, from basic math to algebra and trigonometry, from statistics to college-level calculus. Our intensive programs feature real teaching by real teachers. They're jam-packed with hours of hands-on problem solving and feature hundreds of practice questions, easy-to-follow explanations, and proven strategies. Visit us online at videoaidedinstruction.com for more information about our exciting programs that help take the mystery out of math.